Welcome back, everyone. Tonight, we are diving into a chapter of history that might surprise you. When we hear the word Pope, many of us immediately picture solemn figures in white robes, standing on grand balconies, blessing crowds with calm authority. It is an image of dignity, of moral leadership, of spiritual guidance. But if we turn the clock back to the Middle Ages, that serene picture often looked very different, because behind the prayers and rituals, the papal throne was also one of the most contested power seats in all of Europe. And as with any position of enormous influence, it attracted not only saints and visionaries, but also schemers, ambitious nobles, and men whose actions sometimes shocked the very people they were meant to guide. Tonight's journey begins here, where faith and power collided, and where the stories of scandalous popes remind us that history is not always about piety. Sometimes it is about politics, personal ambition, and choices that feel closer to drama than devotion. In the Middle Ages, the Pope was not just the spiritual head of the Christian world. He was also a kingmaker, a political influencer, and at times a military strategist. His word could crown emperors, launch wars, or settle disputes between kingdoms. With so much authority at stake, becoming pope was less like joining a monastery, and more like stepping into a battlefield where wealth, family alliances, and even betrayal all played a part. And here's the fascinating thing: people of that time were not always shocked by this. They expected some politics, but there were moments when papal behavior crossed so far over the line that even citizens of medieval Rome, people accustomed to chaos, could not help but gasp. Think for a moment when someone is handed near absolute power, with little oversight. How do they act? Some rise to the occasion with humility. Others treat the Vatican more like a personal playground. For instance, imagine a pope so young he was barely out of adolescence, suddenly placed in charge of the church. Instead of showing restraint, he indulged in the hobbies of nobility, lavish feasts, extravagant clothing, and, according to chroniclers, even gambling sessions. Can you picture the scene? Cardinals and clerics entering an audience chamber, only to see dice rolling across the table while decisions of faith hung in the balance. It sounds unbelievable, but it happened. And the lesson here is not just about pointing fingers. It is about realizing that leadership does not erase human weakness. Sometimes it magnifies it. Some papal scandals were not just about excess. They revealed how entangled the church had become with noble families and political power. Positions were bought, alliances were traded, and even the most sacred offices could become bargaining chips. This practice, known as nepotism and simony, was so widespread that entire generations began to see the papacy less as a holy seat and more as a prize to be won. One chronicler described the papal court of the 10th and 11th centuries as a stage for ambition, and truly, it played out like a performance dramatic rivalries, whispered deals, and sudden downfalls. Some popes were respected reformers, but others became infamous for the exact opposite. The clash between expectation and reality often left ordinary believers in a state of disillusionment. They wanted shepherds of faith, but instead found men chasing influence, wealth, or personal glory. And yet, even with scandals erupting, people continued to believe, continued to pray, and continued to hold out hope that faith could outlast flawed leadership. That resilience of belief, despite disillusionment, is something profoundly human. It shows us that even when institutions falter, the deeper search for meaning does not die. Now, you might be wondering, why should we care about the scandals of long-gone leaders? After all, centuries have passed. But history has a way of repeating itself. These stories of corruption, ambition, and unchecked power feel surprisingly familiar when we think about modern politics, business, or even community leadership. The truth is, institutions are shaped by the people who lead them, and people, for all their strengths, carry flaws. The papal scandals of the Middle Ages are not just tales of the past. They are cautionary reminders for us now. Imagine what it felt like for ordinary citizens in Rome at the time, walking past the papal palace and hearing rumors of dice games or whispered accusations of bribery. Faithful men and women must have wondered whether the man at the head of their church truly represented holiness, or whether he was simply another nobleman playing the game of power. That tension between what people long for in leaders and what they actually get is one of history's recurring themes, and perhaps it is one of life's lessons, that every time we place all our trust in an institution, we have to remember it is made of people flawed, ambitious, sometimes noble, sometimes weak. In tonight's episode, we will explore these moments in detail. We will see how a pope's obsession with gambling shocked the faithful, how another pope's attempt to step down for love turned into chaos, and how the papacy itself became a prize fought over by kings, nobles, and ambitious families. We will talk about the ripple effects, how these scandals did not just embarrass the church, but reshaped politics and faith across Europe. And here's the most intriguing part. Even in the midst of this chaos, people continued to believe. They continued to look for spiritual truth, even when leaders fell short. That balance between disappointment in institutions and the search for meaning is something deeply human, and it connects us to those who lived 1,000 years ago. So as we start this story, keep this in mind. History is not about flawless heroes. It is about real people navigating power, temptation, and responsibility. Some failed spectacularly. Some tried to rise above the storm, and all left a mark that echoes through time. If you have ever wondered how even the holiest institutions could stumble, or what happens when ambition overshadows humility, then stay with me, because tonight we are stepping into the world of scandalous medieval popes, a world where faith was powerful, but humanity was impossible to hide. And as the centuries rolled on, the papacy did not become less dramatic. It simply changed its costume. If the medieval scandals were marked by youthful recklessness, whispered bribes, and the occasional shocking outburst, then the Renaissance took everything to a new stage. Gilded with marble and painted ceilings, the Renaissance was a time of rebirth, of art and culture, but also of ambition that sparkled like jewels under candlelight. Popes of this era did not just see themselves as spiritual fathers. They became princes of the Renaissance world, weaving politics, art, and even family fortunes into the fabric of the Vatican. One of the most famous figures was Rodrigo Borgia, who became Pope Alexander VI. His election in 1492, the very year Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic, was not a matter of quiet prayers alone. Chronicles suggest that the vote was secured with lavish gifts, promises, and rewards. Imagine cardinals receiving not just blessings, but palaces, gold, and privileges in exchange for support. To us, it might sound more like the plot of a political drama than the sacred choosing of a leader, yet for those who lived in that era, this was the reality. A papacy where influence could be purchased, and where a successful campaign looked more like a coronation by wealth than by faith. And Alexander VI was no ordinary pope. He was a patriarch of the Borgia family, and under his reign, his children Lucrezia and Cesare became central players in European politics. Their lives were filled with alliances, strategic marriages, and endless intrigue. To picture Cesare Borgia, think less of a robed cardinal and more of an armored commander, riding at the head of troops, plotting campaigns, and using every tool at his disposal to carve out power. The church robe, in his case, was only a temporary costume. He preferred the steel of a sword and the strategies of a general. What fascinates me is how openly the papacy blended with the culture of Renaissance courts. These leaders funded artists, built grand palaces, and surrounded themselves with the finest luxuries, as if the Vatican were simply another princely domain. It is during this time that the boundaries between spiritual authority and worldly power blurred almost completely. The Pope was not only the voice of faith, but also the head of a political dynasty, shaping alliances and wars with the same hand that signed blessings. If Alexander embodied decadence and family ambition, Julius II took the papacy down yet another surprising path. Known as the warrior pope, Julius did not hide behind the walls of the Vatican. He marched into battle, clad in armor, commanding armies with the determination of a seasoned general. It was not just a metaphor. He physically led troops, reclaiming lost territories and asserting papal control by force of arms. Imagine a pope not only commissioning Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling, but also strapping on a breastplate and riding into the chaos of battle. This was Julius, a man of war, art, and unrelenting energy. And it is here that the contradictions of the Renaissance papacy shine most brightly. Julius could summon the greatest artists of the age, leaving us legacies of breathtaking beauty, while at the same time draining the coffers of the church to finance his campaigns. He could walk among painters and sculptors one day, then shout orders to soldiers the next. To him, the papacy was not a quiet retreat, but a throne of thunder, demanding bold action. The Renaissance also brought with it a taste for exotic wonders. Pope Leo X, for instance, famously kept a beloved elephant named Hanno in the Vatican. This magnificent animal, gifted from abroad, became a symbol of papal wealth and spectacle. The elephant had its own marble house, lavishly cared for, as though it were a prince of the animal kingdom. While peasants struggled to feed their families, the Vatican displayed its grandeur with creatures, artworks, and entertainments that dazzled and shocked in equal measure. This is the point in history where many faithful observers began to question whether the papacy had strayed too far into the world of power and display. Fundraising methods became aggressive, indulgences were sold, and money poured in to support the grand projects of art and war. On one hand, the Renaissance popes gave us some of the most beautiful cultural achievements the world has ever seen. On the other, their extravagance left the church vulnerable to criticism, and ultimately to the waves of reform that were soon to follow. But before we rush ahead, let us pause to reflect. What we see in the Renaissance papacy is a lesson about leadership and legacy. These popes wanted to be remembered not only as spiritual guides, but as kings of culture, commanders of armies, and patrons of brilliance. And in many ways, they succeeded. Centuries later, their art still captivates us. Their names still echo in history books. Yet their choices also remind us of the dangers of unchecked ambition, of wealth and power, overshadowing the very principles they were meant to uphold. It is easy to laugh at the image of a pope marching into battle, or pampering an elephant while Europe trembled with poverty, but it is also important to see the deeper pattern. Leaders, when given vast authority, often choose to leave a legacy that reflects their own values, whether that is art, conquest, or spectacle. And sometimes that legacy inspires generations, while other times it provokes reform, rebellion, and calls for change. As we continue our story, keep in mind this fascinating balance. The same hands that sign decrees of faith also sign contracts for palaces, paintings, and war campaigns. The Renaissance popes remind us that institutions of power are never one-dimensional. They are arenas where human ambition, creativity, and flaws meet in dramatic and unforgettable ways. And so, from medieval scandals of dice and whispered deals, we now step into Renaissance courts of grandeur and steel, where the papacy was both a throne of faith and a stage for spectacle. The story of scandalous popes does not fade. It transforms, and it will lead us further into the intertwining worlds of medicine, economy, and ritual that defined their age and ours. And while the Renaissance papacy dazzled with art, armor, and elephants, the broader medieval and ancient world was wrestling with a different set of challenges: how to understand the human body, how to treat sickness, and how to organize society's wealth in ways that kept people alive. It is one of the most fascinating shifts in our story, because it reminds us that behind the gilded halls of power, everyday life was fragile. Illness, hunger, and uncertainty were constant companions, and the solutions people developed reveal both their creativity and their limits. Medicine in the Middle Ages was a strange mixture of science, tradition, and belief. Imagine walking into a dimly lit chamber, the smell of herbs and burning candles in the air, and being told that your sickness came from bad air or from too much blood in your body. This was the era of the miasma theory and the four humors ideas that seem odd to us now, but made sense when the understanding of germs and infection was still centuries away. Doctors and barbers, yes, barbers often doubled as surgeons, would recommend bloodletting to rebalance the humors. A cut with a knife or the placement of leeches was thought to cleanse the body of excess. Sometimes, by accident, this worked. Lowering blood pressure or reducing fever could offer relief. But many times, patients were weakened, and some even died not from their original illness, but from the cure itself. Leeches became so popular that they were traded like precious goods. In some parts of Europe, demand was so high that shortages occurred, and people hoarded them like treasure. To us it sounds strange, but to them this was medicine, as normal as a pharmacy is today. And beyond leeches, there were herbal remedies: garlic, willow bark, mint, and countless plants gathered, boiled, and prescribed for everything from headaches to melancholy. Some of these, surprisingly, contained real chemical compounds like salicin in willow bark, the ancestor of aspirin. It is a reminder that even in the fog of misunderstanding, real discoveries sometimes slipped through. But medicine was not just about the body. It was also about belief. If someone fell ill, prayers and rituals often accompanied treatment. The church played a role here too. Priests might bless water, relics might be pressed to the sick, and processions might carry icons through towns plagued by disease. Faith and medicine were intertwined because people believed sickness was not only physical but spiritual. Now, let us shift to the economy, another invisible force shaping daily life. In many ancient and medieval societies, temples were not only centers of worship but also economic engines. Picture a great stone complex, priests recording grain tallies on tablets, workers toiling in temple fields, and storehouses filled with food to be redistributed. Payment often came not in coins but in rations: loaves of bread, jugs of beer, sacks of barley. Wealth was measured in what you could eat, store, or exchange, not necessarily in shiny metal. The state often set prices to maintain balance. Lists survive showing how many loaves of bread equaled a goat, or how much barley equaled a pair of sandals. This was not a free market. It was a controlled system designed to keep society stable. In times of famine or war, rulers imposed limits on grain exports or capped bread prices, believing it was better to restrict trade than to risk starvation. Sound familiar? Even today, governments intervene in markets, subsidizing farmers or regulating fuel prices. The logic has not changed, only the tools have. As trade expanded, money evolved. In China, Paper currency circulated nearly 1,000 years before Europe even considered the idea. In India, punch-marked silver coins and even shells served as currency in different regions. Along the Silk Roads, caravans carried spices, silks, gems, and metals, linking continents in a vast network. What is remarkable is how much of this economy was tied to faith. Temples acted as banks, holding treasuries, lending money, and sometimes even issuing receipts. Religion and economy were not separate. They were braided together, each supporting the other. This intertwining of medicine, economy, and ritual shows us something important. Survival was not just about science or trade alone. It was about meaning. When people felt powerless against plague or famine, they turned to ritual, to prayer, to stories that gave shape to suffering. And when leaders wanted to keep order, they used both practical measures like rationing and symbolic acts like blessing the harvest. There is also a lesson here about human ingenuity. Even without microscopes, people observed patterns. They noticed that clean water mattered, that fresh air helped, that certain herbs eased pain. Even without modern economics, they built systems of distribution, rationing, and exchange that kept millions alive. And even without modern psychology, they understood that healing required not only treating the body, but comforting the spirit. For me, what stands out is how much of this echoes today. We may no longer use leeches as first-line medicine, but we still chase miracle cures. We may no longer pay in barley and beer, but we still measure wealth in things that do not always reflect real human need. And we still rely on ritual, whether it is a doctor's white coat, a prescription pad, or even the comfort of a familiar prayer. The details have changed, but the human needs remain. So as we move from the scandalous corridors of papal power into the daily realities of healing and survival, we see another side of history. It is not all about leaders and wars. It is about how ordinary people tried to make sense of sickness, how communities kept their economies running, and how faith infused every attempt to survive. It is a reminder that history is not just drama at the top, but resilience at the ground level. And so, our journey continues. From dice-rolling popes to Renaissance patrons in armor, we now step into a world of leeches, grain rations, and temple treasuries, a world that shows us the foundations of how humans have always tried to heal, to trade, and to believe. The story is far from over, because from here we will move into sanctuaries of healing, where dreams and rituals became medicine, and where the line between science and faith blurred in ways that still resonate today. And if medicine in the medieval and ancient world was often a blend of trial, error, and prayer, then healing sanctuaries like those of ancient Greece show us how health was never just about the body. It was also about the mind, the soul, and the spaces people created to restore balance. Perhaps the most famous of these sanctuaries was Epidaurus, dedicated to Asclepius, the god of healing. To step into Epidaurus was not like entering a hospital. It was more like arriving at a sacred retreat, where every detail, from the architecture to the rituals, was designed to soothe, inspire, and transform. Picture the scene: pilgrims arriving after long journeys, some limping, some blind, others carried by family and friends on makeshift stretchers. They came with chronic illnesses, mental torment, infertility, or ailments that baffled local physicians. If ordinary cures had failed, this was the place of last hope. Here, beneath colonnades and under the watch of priests, they sought something deeper than medicine they sought, meaning. The core ritual was called incubation. Patients would enter a special dormitory known as the abaton. There, in silence and darkness, they would lie down to sleep, believing that Asclepius himself might visit them in dreams. The god's appearance could bring visions of healing or instructions for remedies. In the morning, priests called therapeutes, literally attendants, would listen to the dreams and interpret them, offering guidance or symbolic cures. It was part therapy, part ritual, and part storytelling. Even without modern psychology, they understood the power of dreams to reveal inner fears, desires, and possibilities for change. But Epidaurus was not just about sleeping and waiting for divine messages. It was a complete environment of healing. Water, considered sacred, was central. Patients bathed in spring-fed pools to purify body and soul. Gardens and colonnades were laid out in ways that encouraged walking, reflection, and calm. The architecture itself was treatment-soaring columns and balanced symmetry, designed to uplift the spirit and bring order to troubled minds. And then there was the theater. Yes, a massive, open-air theater stood within the sanctuary, not as entertainment, but as therapy. The Greeks believed that drama could cleanse the soul through a process they called catharsis. Watching a tragedy unfold, experiencing grief, anger, joy, or laughter in a collective setting was seen as a form of medicine. To cry at the suffering of a hero or laugh at the folly of a fool was to release one's own pent-up emotions. Drama was not distraction, it was healing. In many ways, it was group therapy 2,000 years before psychology gave it a name. Other treatments combined practical and mystical elements. There were herbal remedies, massages, dietary prescriptions, and rituals involving sacred animals like snakes, which symbolized renewal. Sacred objects and inscriptions recorded miraculous cures: a blind man who regained sight after a dream, a paralyzed woman who walked again after bathing in holy water. Whether these were fact, faith, or placebo, they gave hope, and hope itself is a powerful medicine. What strikes me is how modern some of this feels. Today we speak of holistic health, of treating not only symptoms but lifestyle, stress, and mental well-being. Wellness retreats offer yoga, meditation, sound baths, and carefully designed architecture meant to calm and inspire. In many ways, these are echoes of Epidaurus. We still crave spaces where healing is not just mechanical but meaningful, where mind, body, and spirit align. But sanctuaries like Epidaurus also show us something else. Healing was communal. Pilgrims came together, shared their stories, slept side by side, and watched plays together. Illness was not a private burden, but a shared journey. And in that community, people found not only cures but solidarity. Even if the god did not appear in a dream, the patient left, knowing they were not alone. It is important to remember that sanctuaries like this were not limited to Greece. In Egypt, temples of Imhotep offered similar rituals. In India and China, sacred sites blended prayer with medicine. Across cultures, the idea that healing required sacred space was universal. What varied was the language: Asclepius in Greece, divine winds in China, temple rituals in Egypt. But the principle was the same. True healing touched every part of the human being. There is a lesson here for us today. We often separate medicine from meaning, treating bodies as machines to be repaired, but history reminds us that people have always needed more. We need rituals to process grief, art to express emotions, architecture that calms us, and stories that give us hope. Science is powerful, but healing is larger than science alone. Asclepius himself may have faded into myth when Christianity rose and pagan temples closed, but his legacy endures. The serpent staff of Asclepius is still the global symbol of medicine, and the idea that healing must address the whole person, mind, body, and spirit, remains alive in modern holistic care. So when we look at Epidaurus, we do not just see ruins of stone, We see an ancient vision of what health could be, not just survival, but transformation. Patients arrived broken, frightened, and desperate. They left with new stories, new strength, and sometimes new life. Whether the cures were miraculous or symbolic hardly mattered. What mattered was that the sanctuary gave meaning to suffering, dignity to the sick, and a sense of hope that outlived the illness itself. And so, as our journey unfolds, we move from the political dramas of popes and princes to the quiet sanctuaries where healing was as much about dreams as medicine, as much about community as cure. It reminds us that history is not just a record of battles and scandals. It is also a record of humanity's endless search for wholeness. And that search, in many ways, continues with us today. Yet for all the sanctuaries of healing and the search for balance, history has a way of swinging back to the extremes of human ambition. If Epidaurus showed us the dignity of hope, the papal courts of the 9th century gave us one of the strangest and most unsettling spectacles ever recorded, the infamous Cadaver Synod. Even by the standards of an age filled with intrigue, this episode pushed boundaries so far that it shocked even the hardened citizens of Rome. It is the moment when justice, religion, and theater collided in a single grotesque trial, not of a living man, but of a corpse. Story begins with Pope Formosus, who reigned in the late 9th century. His time as pope was turbulent, marked by political rivalries and shifting allegiances. After his death, his enemies were not content to let his memory rest. Instead, years later, his successor, Pope Stephen VI, ordered Formosus's body exhumed and put on trial. Yes, quite literally, his decaying body was propped up on a throne, dressed in papal robes, and placed before a court of bishops to face charges. The accusations ranged from perjury to breaking canon law. Of course, Formosus could not speak in his own defense, so a deacon was appointed to answer on behalf of the corpse. Imagine the scene: a dark hall filled with clerics, the stench of decay in the air, candles flickering, while a lifeless figure in ceremonial robes was interrogated as though the outcome mattered. The absurdity of it all was not lost on the people of Rome. Chroniclers note that the trial caused widespread outrage. Citizens who had seen scandal after scandal finally reached their limit. The court, however, proceeded with chilling seriousness. Formosus was declared guilty, his papal acts annulled, and as punishment, 3 fingers of his right hand, the ones used for blessings, were cut off. His body was stripped of robes and thrown into the Tiber River. To his enemies, it was a symbolic cleansing of his legacy. To everyone else, it was a horrifying misuse of spiritual authority. The Cadaver Synod has puzzled historians for centuries. Was it driven purely by hatred, by the desire to erase a rival's influence, or was it a warning to others who might oppose the reigning pope? Whatever the motive, the result was the same: a spectacle that discredited the papacy more than it strengthened it. Riots broke out in Rome, Pope Stephen VI was overthrown, and Formosus's body was eventually retrieved and reburied with honor. But the damage was done. Trust in the papacy was shaken, and the image of a corpse on trial lingered in the collective memory as a symbol of how far ambition could corrupt sacred office. When I reflect on this story, I can't help but think of it as both tragic and strangely theatrical. It was history's version of political theater, taken to its most literal extreme. A leader's body became a prop, his memory a stage, his trial an act in a play of vengeance. And like any play taken too far, the audience, in this case, the people of Rome, revolted. It reminds us that no matter how powerful leaders may seem, there is always a line beyond which people will not follow. There is also something deeply human here. The Cadaver Synod shows us how institutions, when consumed by rivalry, can lose sight of their purpose. Instead of guiding souls, the papacy in that moment became a stage for vendettas. Instead of healing, it inflicted humiliation. And yet, in the backlash, we see the resilience of ordinary people. Rome rose up, demanded dignity, and restored some measure of sanity, even if only temporarily. The lesson resonates even today. Institutions, whether religious, political, or social, are vulnerable to the flaws of those who lead them. They can be twisted into arenas for personal revenge, or theater meant to humiliate rivals. But they also rely on the consent of the people, and when that consent is withdrawn, even the grandest performance collapses. The Cadaver Synod is remembered not because it strengthened authority, but because it revealed its absurdity. It is also a reminder of the power of symbols. Cutting off a corpse's fingers may seem pointless, but in the medieval imagination, those fingers represented blessings, authority, and the continuity of sacred power. By desecrating them, Pope Stephen sought to rewrite history, yet symbols cut both ways. For many, the image of mutilating a dead pope symbolized not strength, but cruelty. And in the end, it was Stephen, not Formosus, who lost legitimacy. When you think about it, history is filled with such moments, times when leaders stage dramatic gestures to prove their dominance, only to undermine themselves in the eyes of the people. The Cadaver Synod stands as one of the clearest examples, because its absurdity is impossible to ignore. It forces us to ask, what is justice, and when does justice turn into spectacle? What does it mean when leaders put theater above truth? And how often do we see echoes of that today, when public trials or political feuds seem more about show than substance? So from the healing sanctuaries of Greece, where dreams offered hope, we move to the courts of Rome, where nightmares became real. It is a sharp contrast on one side, rituals designed to restore dignity, and on the other, rituals twisted to destroy it. Together they reveal the full range of human history, our capacity for compassion and our capacity for cruelty, and in both, the search for meaning never disappears. As we continue our journey, we will see that this bizarre trial was not the end of papal scandal. In fact, it was only one chapter in a long line of episodes where ambition, rivalry, and excess reshaped the Church. From here we step into the 14th century, when the papacy itself fractured into multiple claimants, and the spectacle of division threatened to tear the Christian world apart. From the surreal spectacle of the Cadaver Synod, where a corpse was dragged into court as if justice could reach beyond the grave, history carried us forward into an even larger crisis, one that shook the very structure of the Church itself. If one pope could cause scandal and confusion, what happens when there are two, or even three? This was not fiction, but reality in the late Middle Ages, when the papacy entered one of its most chaotic chapters, the Great Western Schism. The seeds of division were sown in the early 14th century, during the so-called Avignon papacy. For nearly 70 years, beginning in 1309, the papal court abandoned Rome and settled in the French city of Avignon. Officially, the move was justified as a way to escape the violence and instability of Rome, but to many observers it seemed like the papacy had become captive to French influence. Imagine the unease of believers who had always thought of Rome as the eternal heart of Christianity, now hearing that their pope was living in a palace along the Rhone River, surrounded by French cardinals and French politics. During this period, the Avignon papacy became wealthy and powerful, but also deeply unpopular. Critics accused it of corruption and of being too closely tied to the French crown. Calls for reform grew louder, and eventually, in 1377, Pope Gregory XI decided to return the papacy to Rome. At first, this seemed like the end of the problem. Rome rejoiced, and the symbolism of the papal throne back in its ancient seat gave hope. But the peace did not last. Gregory XI died the next year, and the election that followed would plunge the Church into chaos. In 1378, under pressure from a Roman crowd demanding an Italian pope, the cardinals elected Urban VI. But Urban quickly proved to be a difficult figure, harsh in his reforms, and alienating many of the same cardinals who had chosen him. Within months, a group of them declared his election invalid and chose another pope, Clement VII, who set up his court back in Avignon. Suddenly, the Christian world had two popes, each claiming to be the true successor of St. Peter, each excommunicating the other, and each with kings and princes across Europe choosing sides. The schism split Europe along political lines. France, Scotland, and parts of Spain supported the Avignon Pope. England, the Holy Roman Empire, and much of Northern Europe supported the Roman Pope. For ordinary believers, the situation was deeply unsettling. Imagine being told that one pope was the vicar of Christ and the other was an impostor, only to hear the exact same claim from the other side. Which blessings were valid? Which sacraments counted? Who truly held the keys of heaven? Faith, already strained by corruption and scandal, now faced the confusion of divided authority. And as if two popes were not enough, the situation grew even worse. In 1409, a council was convened at Pisa to resolve the crisis. The idea was simple: depose both rival popes and elect a new one to restore unity. But instead of solving the problem, the council created a third pope. Now 3 men claimed to be the rightful leader of the church, each with their own supporters, courts, and power. Historians sometimes describe this as a theological disaster, or, more bluntly, a dumpster fire. It was a moment when the papacy, meant to symbolize unity, instead embodied division. The schism dragged on for nearly 40 years. It was finally resolved at the Council of Constance, 1414 to 1418, where church leaders and secular rulers came together to restore order. After much negotiation, the rival claimants were removed or persuaded to resign, and a new pope, Martin V, was elected. Unity was restored, at least on paper, but the damage to the reputation of the papacy was profound. Generations of Christians had grown up under rival popes, seeing firsthand how politics, not spirituality, often determined who wore the papal crown. When we look back at the Great Western Schism, it is tempting to view it as medieval chaos at its worst. But there are deeper lessons here. The schism shows how fragile authority can be when it loses the trust of the people. The Pope was supposed to be a singular symbol of continuity, yet political ambition and rivalry turned that unity into fragmentation. Once the image of one supreme shepherd was broken into competing voices, the cracks in the institution became visible to everyone. It also shows us how interconnected religion and politics were in the Middle Ages. Kings and princes supported whichever pope best served their interests, turning what should have been a matter of faith into a chess game of diplomacy. For the ordinary believer, faith was personal, but for rulers, faith was strategy. The papacy became another battlefield in the endless struggle for power in Europe. And if we step back, there is something profoundly human about it. Institutions are only as strong as the people who run them. When ambition outweighs humility, when rivalry overshadows unity, even the most sacred offices can fracture. The Great Western Schism reminds us that faith may be divine, but leadership is human. And humanity, with all its flaws, can bring even the loftiest ideals down to earth. The echoes of this schism would last far beyond its resolution. It planted seeds of doubt, showing that the papacy could be contested, its legitimacy challenged, its authority divided. That lingering doubt would make later reform movements, like those in the 16th century, all the more powerful. After all, once people had lived through the spectacle of 3 popes at once, it was harder to believe in the unshakable authority of just one. So, from the grotesque theater of a corpse on trial, we have now arrived at the grand stage of Europe itself, where rival popes turned faith into faction. It is another reminder that history is not always the story of unity and order, but often of conflict and confusion. And yet, within that confusion, people continued to pray, continued to search for meaning, and continued to hope for leaders worthy of their devotion. As our story moves forward, we will see how the papacy, once reunited, did not abandon spectacle, but embraced it even more, turning to art, wealth, and grandeur to reassert its power. The Renaissance popes we met earlier were shaped in part by this very crisis, determined to project strength through culture and splendor. But as we shall see, even that strategy carried its own scandals, leaving behind stories that continue to fascinate us today. And so, after the chaos of the Great Western Schism had finally ended and unity seemed restored, the papacy faced a new era, one that was no longer defined only by division but by the dazzling excesses of the Renaissance. It was in this period that one of the most infamous figures ever to sit on the papal throne rose to power, Rodrigo Borgia, who became Pope Alexander VI. His story reads less like the life of a spiritual leader and more like the script of a grand Renaissance drama, complete with alliances, betrayals, whispered rumors, and the rise of a family whose very name still carries the weight of scandal. Alexander VI was elected in 1492, a year already heavy with symbolism. The same year Columbus crossed the Atlantic and changed the map of the known world. His election, however, was not celebrated for its holiness. Chroniclers of the time and many later historians have pointed out that his rise was accompanied by a flood of bribes and promises. Cardinals were said to have received palaces, gold, and favors in exchange for their votes. It was not so much a sacred selection as a calculated transaction. The Vatican transformed into a political marketplace. Once in power, Alexander VI placed his family at the center of papal politics. His children, most famously Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia, became instruments of his ambition. Cesare, originally made a cardinal while still very young, soon abandoned the red robes for armor. He preferred the life of a soldier, leading armies, negotiating with kings, and orchestrating power plays that earned him a reputation both feared and admired. In him, people saw the prototype of the ruthless Renaissance prince, brilliant, bold, and utterly unafraid of using force to achieve his goals. Lucrezia, meanwhile, became a symbol of strategic marriage. She was wed multiple times to powerful men, each alliance strengthening the Borgia grip on politics. Though many rumors swirled around her personal life, some exaggerated, some invented by enemies, there is no doubt that she played a key role in her family's web of influence. In an age when women were often excluded from direct power, she navigated the treacherous waters of Renaissance politics with skill, ensuring that the name Borgia remained central to every negotiation. What makes Alexander VI so fascinating is the contrast he embodied. On one hand, he was a patron of art, a skilled diplomat, and a shrewd manager of power. On the other, he became the face of corruption, nepotism, and excess. He turned the Vatican into a family stronghold, using its authority not only to guide souls, but to build a dynasty. To many of his contemporaries, this was a betrayal of the very essence of the papacy. To others, It was simply the reality of the Renaissance world, where power and faith were always intertwined. It is worth pausing here to reflect on how ordinary people must have felt. For the faithful, the papacy was supposed to be a beacon of spiritual purity. Yet they heard stories of palaces gifted for loyalty, of alliances sealed not with prayers, but with daggers and dowries. Imagine being a farmer in Spain or a merchant in Italy, listening to sermons about humility, while also hearing that the Pope's children were leading armies and negotiating marriages like kings and queens. The contradiction would have been impossible to ignore. And yet, Alexander VI also had undeniable charisma. His ability to navigate the dangerous politics of his time kept him in power for more than a decade. He secured the support of allies, maintained influence in Rome, and shaped European politics in ways that lasted long after his death. The Borgia name became synonymous with ambition, but also with survival. In a world where one misstep could mean ruin. From a modern perspective, his papacy raises questions about leadership and legacy. Can we judge Alexander VI only by the scandals, or must we also acknowledge the cultural and political impact he had? Was he a villain who corrupted the papacy, or simply a man of his time, playing the game as everyone else did, only with greater success? History rarely offers simple answers, and the story of Alexander VI reminds us that power often carries both brilliance and corruption in equal measure. What we can say with certainty is that the Borgia era left an indelible mark. The family's rise and fall became the stuff of legend, fueling plays, novels, and endless speculation. Even centuries later, the name Borgia evokes images of intrigue and ambition, as if their story has never truly ended. As our journey continues, the figure of Alexander VI serves as a bridge between the fractured papacy of the schism and the flamboyant displays of Renaissance power. His reign shows us how the papacy could act not only as a spiritual office, but as the center of a political dynasty, shaping alliances across Europe. It also reminds us of the dangers of unchecked ambition, of turning sacred institutions into stages for family glory. And yet, in the same era, another pope would take the theatricality of the office in an entirely different direction, not with family ambition, but with military might. The stage now shifts from the schemes of the Borgias to the clashing armor of Julius II, the so-called warrior pope, who marched into battle as if the Vatican itself were a kingdom forged in steel. If Alexander VI turned the Vatican into the stronghold of a family dynasty, then his successor Julius II transformed the papacy into something even more startling, a battlefield command post. Known to history as the warrior pope, Julius II shattered any lingering illusions that popes were merely cloistered priests. He was a man who believed the papacy should not only rule souls, but also rule lands, and he pursued that vision with armor, armies, and an iron will. Born Giuliano della Rovere, Julius rose to power in 1503 after years of maneuvering in the turbulent politics of Italy. From the very start, he was different from his predecessors. While others cultivated family fortunes or indulged in lavish entertainments, Julius saw the papacy as a weapon for shaping Europe. He had little patience for subtlety. He swore like a soldier, plotted like a general, and thought nothing of leading troops personally into battle. Chroniclers record him riding at the head of his forces in full plate armor, his papal robes left behind, replaced by the gleam of steel and the dust of the campaign trail. To him, the papal states were not just lands. They were the foundation of papal independence. If they were weak, the pope was vulnerable. If they were strong, the pope could stand equal to kings and emperors. So Julius marched, besieged, and conquered. Determined to expand and protect papal territory, he forged alliances with powerful rulers, then broke them when they no longer suited his aims. He was not afraid of contradiction. What mattered was victory. But Julius was more than just a warrior. He was also a patron of art on a scale few could match. It was under his rule that Michelangelo was commissioned to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, an undertaking that would become one of the greatest masterpieces in history. It was Julius who envisioned rebuilding St. Peter's Basilica into the grand monument we know today, hiring architects like Bramante to turn his dream into stone. In his mind, war and art were two sides of the same coin, both tools to glorify the papacy and ensure that its power would echo through the centuries. Imagine Rome at the time, soldiers marching through its streets, while in nearby workshops, sculptors and painters labored under candlelight, their creations destined to fill chapels and palaces. The clang of armor and the strokes of a brush coexisted, both driven by the same man's relentless vision. Julius was not content to simply guide souls. He wanted to leave monuments that would outlast empires. And in that he succeeded. To this day, when people gaze at the Sistine ceiling or walk through St. Peter's, they are witnessing the legacy of Julius II's ambition. Yet his reign was not without criticism. Many contemporaries were uneasy at the sight of a pope leading armies into war. Some whispered that he cared more for conquest than for prayer, more for monuments than for mercy. His aggressive fundraising, which included the sale of indulgences, angered many and laid the groundwork for the calls for reform that would erupt only a few decades later. For every admirer who praised his strength, there were others who saw in him a troubling distortion of spiritual leadership. And yet, history is rarely black and white. Julius II was a paradox, a man of violence who also gave the world unparalleled beauty, a leader who swore like a soldier yet dreamed like an artist. Perhaps this is why his story continues to fascinate us. He shows us that power is never one-dimensional. Leaders can embody contradictions, pursuing glory with one hand while inspiring awe with the other. I often wonder what ordinary Romans must have felt, seeing their pope ride out in armor one week and unveiling grand artistic projects the next. Did they feel pride that their city was at the center of history's stage, or unease that their spiritual leader was acting like a warlord? Perhaps it was both. After all, human beings are capable of holding contradictions in their hearts. Pride and doubt can live side by side, just as faith and ambition did in Julius II. The legacy of the warrior pope also raises a question about leadership that resonates even now. Is it better for leaders to wield power through fear or to inspire through creation? Julius attempted both, and perhaps that is why he remains unforgettable. His armies secured the papal states, but it is the art he sponsored that endures in the minds of billions. No one today studies the details of his campaigns, but millions gaze in awe at Michelangelo's ceiling. That is the irony of ambition. What we think will define us may be forgotten, while what we sponsor in moments of vision may live forever. As our journey continues, Julius II's story serves as both climax and warning. He embodied the Renaissance papacy at its most dramatic, part soldier, part patron, part priest, part prince. His ambition gave Rome treasures beyond price, but it also fueled the sense that the papacy was more concerned with earthly glory than heavenly humility. And that perception would not be forgotten. It would sow seeds of discontent that would grow into movements demanding reform, movements that would change the course of history. From the intrigues of the Borgias to the thunder of Julius's armies, the papacy had become a stage for spectacle. But even this was not the limit of Renaissance extravagance. Another pope, Leo X, would soon take the Vatican's appetite for splendor and indulgence to new heights, filling it not only with art and music, but with exotic animals, lavish feasts, and policies that would push Europe to the edge of transformation. If Julius II was remembered as the warrior pope striding into battle with sword and armor, then his successor Leo X carried the papacy into an age of splendor so dazzling that even the most worldly courtiers of Renaissance Italy were astonished. Born Giovanni de' Medici, Leo was the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent of Florence, raised in a world of art, luxury, and humanist learning. When he became pope in 1513, he brought that same Medici spirit into the Vatican, transforming it into a palace of entertainment, spectacle, and excess. Leo X is often remembered for a simple statement he is said to have made: "Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." And indeed he did. Under his reign, the Vatican became a theater of music, banquets, hunting parties, and lavish festivals. Rare animals filled his menagerie, including his beloved elephant Hanno, who became something of a celebrity in Rome. Hanno had a custom marble house, was paraded in public ceremonies, and was showered with gifts from ambassadors eager to impress the Pope. While the people of Rome admired the sight, many also whispered, "Was this truly what the papacy was meant to be?" But Leo's extravagance went beyond animals and entertainments. He poured money into art and architecture, continuing the great projects of Julius II. Raphael painted frescoes for him, architects expanded St. Peter's Basilica, musicians composed works to celebrate papal ceremonies. In many ways, Leo was a patron of culture at its finest. His papacy enriched the artistic heritage of Rome, leaving behind works that still draw admiration today. Yet beauty had a price, and that price nearly bankrupted the papal treasury. To cover the expenses, Leo turned to one of the most controversial practices in church history, the sale of indulgences. In theory, indulgences were a way to reduce the spiritual penalties for sin through acts of devotion, charity, or pilgrimage. But under Leo, indulgences became a fundraising machine. Preachers traveled across Europe, urging the faithful to give money in exchange for spiritual benefits, assuring them that their contributions would speed souls through purgatory and support the building of St. Peter's. For many, this practice felt exploitative. It seemed less about guiding souls and more about financing Rome's appetite for grandeur. Rumors spread of indulgence sellers using dramatic slogans and emotional appeals, stirring both devotion and resentment. Ordinary believers, already burdened by taxes and hardship, were told that their coins could open the gates of heaven for loved ones. Some accepted it, some protested silently, but a growing number began to question whether the Church had lost its way. It was under Leo X that these criticisms reached a breaking point. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther published his famous 95 Theses, challenging the sale of indulgences and sparking debates that would soon ignite the Reformation. In this sense, Leo's extravagance did more than strain the papal treasury. It shook the very foundations of Christian unity. What had begun as a way to fund basilicas and banquets ended up opening the door to one of the greatest transformations in European history. Looking back, Leo X embodies the contradictions of Renaissance papacy. On one hand, he was a man of taste and refinement, a lover of learning and the arts. He supported humanist scholars, commissioned masterpieces, and presided over a Vatican that glittered like never before. On the other, he was a pope who seemed more interested in enjoyment than reform, more concerned with pageantry than humility. His reign reveals how the pursuit of beauty, when unchecked, can drift into extravagance, and how extravagance can provoke consequences far beyond what anyone imagined. I often think about what ordinary people must have felt in those years. Imagine a pilgrim walking into Rome, dazzled by the sight of frescoes, music, and exotic animals, only to return home and hear that indulgences were being sold in their town to pay for it all. Pride and resentment must have mingled in their hearts. On one hand, they were part of a church that produced wonders. On the other, they bore the burden of financing them. That tension, the pull between admiration and disillusionment, was at the core of the early 16th century. Leo's papacy also reminds us of a timeless lesson. Institutions can endure excess for a while, but eventually the weight of criticism becomes too heavy. Just as the cadaver synod had once shocked Rome into outrage, and just as the Great Schism had once divided Europe, Leo's indulgences triggered a wave of resistance that would reshape Christianity forever. The Reformation may have had many causes, but Leo's extravagance was one of the sparks that lit the fire. And yet, Leo himself did not see the danger. Surrounded by courtiers, musicians, and artists, he believed he was elevating the church by making it the cultural heart of Europe. In his mind, he was continuing the legacy of the Medici, blending faith with beauty, spirituality with splendor. Perhaps that was his tragedy, that in trying to glorify the papacy, he made it more vulnerable than ever. So the story of Leo X is not simply one of indulgence, but of unintended consequences. His elephant, his banquets, his frescoes, and his indulgences all form a portrait of a man who wanted to enjoy life, but whose enjoyment changed history. His reign shows us that leadership is not just about taste or culture, it is about responsibility. And when responsibility is forgotten, the consequences can echo for centuries. As we leave the glittering halls of Leo X with their music and marble, we move into another realm of history, the world of medieval and early modern medicine, where theories of blood, air, and humors shaped life and death. Just as Leo's extravagance shows us the excesses of power, medieval medicine will show us the limits of knowledge and the strange, sometimes dangerous ways humans tried to heal themselves before modern science arrived. From the glittering halls of Leo X, filled with banquets, art, and music, we now step into a very different corner of history, one not of splendor, but of survival. For all the magnificence of Renaissance Rome, life for most people in the medieval and early modern world was fragile. Illness struck without warning, epidemics swept through towns, and even minor injuries could become fatal. In a time before microscopes or modern medicine, people turned to theories that seem strange to us now, but were once the best explanations they had. This was the world of bloodletting, leeches, and the mysterious miasma, where doctors, barbers, and priests each played their part in the long struggle against sickness. The guiding framework of medieval medicine was the theory of the four humors, inherited from ancient Greek thought. According to this system, the human body was governed by four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was a matter of balance, and sickness was the result of imbalance. If you were feverish, perhaps you had too much blood. If you were melancholic, perhaps too much black bile. To us, this sounds unscientific, but for centuries it offered a coherent model that people could understand. It gave doctors a way to explain symptoms, and a method, however crude, to attempt cures. One of the most common treatments was bloodletting. The idea was simple. If illness came from an excess of blood, then draining that blood would restore balance. Physicians and barbers, who often doubled as medical practitioners, would cut a vein with a sharp instrument or apply leeches to draw blood slowly. It was a practice so widespread that even the highest figures in society underwent it. Kings, nobles, and clergy alike submitted to the procedure, believing it could cleanse the body of sickness. Sometimes, by chance, it helped. Reducing blood pressure or easing certain fevers could bring relief, but often it weakened patients, leaving them more vulnerable. There are even records of people dying not from their disease, but from the treatment itself. Leeches were especially prized. These small, slimy creatures could drink several times their weight in blood and were considered a gentler option than the knife. Demand for them became so high that Europe experienced shortages in the 19th century, with traders collecting millions of leeches each year. To many households, a jar of leeches was as essential as a box of medicine is today. And though the thought may make us shudder, leeches have not entirely disappeared from medicine. They are still occasionally used in modern surgeries to help restore blood flow. In this way, an ancient remedy has carried into our own time, but bloodletting was only one part of the picture. Another dominant belief was the theory of miasma, or bad air. People thought that foul odors carried disease, and in some sense, they were not entirely wrong. In the days before germ theory, the link between filth and illness was hard to miss. When plague struck, citizens burned incense in the streets, carried flowers to ward off bad smells, and lit massive bonfires to purify the air. In many towns, graveyards were moved outside city walls to keep the bad air away from homes. Though they misunderstood the mechanism, their instincts about cleanliness and air quality sometimes offered real protection. Herbal remedies also played a crucial role. Physicians and apothecaries prescribed plants for nearly every condition. Garlic was used as a natural antibiotic, willow bark for pain relief, mint for digestion, and countless other herbs were boiled, crushed, or steeped in tonics. Some of these remedies contained active compounds that genuinely helped, even if people did not know the science behind them. Willow bark, for example, contains salicin, the chemical ancestor of aspirin. In their trial and error, ancient healers stumbled upon cures that would later be validated by modern science. Medicine in this period was never purely physical. It was also spiritual. Illness was often seen as both a medical and moral condition. Prayers, blessings, and relics were part of treatment. Pilgrimages to holy sites were undertaken in hopes of miraculous cures. In a world where death was always close, people sought comfort in rituals as much as in remedies. The line between doctor and priest was often blurred, and healing could involve both a poultice of herbs and a whispered prayer. What fascinates me is how people responded to uncertainty. Without scientific tools, they relied on observation, tradition, and belief. They saw patterns, smells linked to sickness, herbs easing pain, bloodletting bringing temporary relief, and built systems around them. Many of these systems were flawed, but they reveal a deep human need to make sense of suffering, to find meaning even in illness. Imagine being a peasant in medieval Europe, watching neighbors fall ill from plague. The fear, the helplessness, the desperate hope that a candle, a relic, or a jar of herbs might protect your family. Imagine being a noble lying feverish while a barber applies leeches, trusting that balance will be restored. For us it is history. For them it was life and death. And here lies the lesson. Medicine has always been a blend of knowledge and meaning. We may laugh at miasma theory or cringe at bloodletting, but in their time these practices were serious attempts to grapple with the unknown. They remind us that science evolves slowly, and that each generation builds on the trials of the past. What seems obvious to us now, germs, infection, hygiene, was hidden for centuries, waiting to be uncovered. The story of medieval and ancient medicine is not only about mistakes, it is also about resilience, about the determination to heal in the face of limited knowledge. It shows us that people have always been willing to experiment, to risk, to believe, if it meant saving a life. And though their methods may seem strange, their motivation is timeless. We too seek cures, explanations, and comfort when illness strikes. So from the extravagance of Leo X, we now enter the dim chambers of medieval healers, the bustling apothecaries, the smoke-filled streets, where incense battled bad air. It is a world where science, superstition, and faith walked hand in hand, and where every remedy, whether knife, leech, or prayer, was part of humanity's long journey toward understanding health. And as we move forward, we will see how healing was not just a matter of medicine, but also of sacred space, ritual, and the search for wholeness that extended beyond the body into the very soul. If the world of medieval medicine showed us knives, leeches, and clouds of incense drifting through narrow streets, then the ancient healing sanctuaries of Greece offer us something altogether different. Spaces where healing was not just about treating the body, but about transforming the entire person. Perhaps the most remarkable of these was Epidaurus, a sanctuary dedicated to Asclepius, the god of healing. To step into Epidaurus was not like entering a hospital as we imagine it today. It was closer to arriving at a sacred retreat, where architecture, ritual, and story all worked together to bring comfort and restoration. Pilgrims came from every corner of the Greek world, some traveling for weeks across seas and mountains. They arrived carrying pain, blindness, paralysis, infertility, anxiety, or mysterious fevers that local physicians could not cure. For many, Epidaurus was the final hope. Families carried relatives on stretchers, desperate to find relief. Some came limping, others trembling, all drawn by the belief that here, under the watch of Asclepius, they might find healing that went beyond medicine. The central ritual of Epidaurus was called incubation. Patients were guided into a special dormitory known as the abaton. There, in silence, they would lie down to sleep, believing that during the night the god would visit them in dreams. These dreams were not ordinary. They were considered messages from the divine, carrying instructions for cures or visions of recovery. In the morning, priests known as therapists listened to these dreams and offered interpretations. They prescribed rituals, diets, or exercises based on what the dreams revealed. To us, this might sound like therapy mixed with religion, but to the Greeks, it was a sacred science of the soul. Epidaurus was designed to heal, not only through ritual, but through environment. Water flowed from springs considered holy, and bathing in these waters was believed to cleanse both body and spirit. Gardens, colonnades, and open courtyards encouraged reflection and calm. Even the architecture played its part. Harmonious columns and balanced proportions lifted the heart and soothed the mind. Healing was not an isolated act, but an experience woven into every stone, every path, every prayer. Perhaps the most extraordinary feature was the theater. Yes, in the heart of this sanctuary stood a vast open-air theater with near-perfect acoustics, where thousands could gather to watch plays. But this was no mere entertainment. The Greeks believed in catharsis, the cleansing of the soul through emotion. Watching a tragedy unfold, shedding tears at the downfall of a hero, or laughing at a comedy was seen as therapy. The emotions stirred by drama were thought to release inner tension, to purify the heart. In this way, theater itself became medicine. Imagine pilgrims who had come with physical pain, finding relief not only in baths or rituals, but in the shared experience of watching stories that mirrored their own struggles. Other treatments blended the mystical with the practical. Patients were given herbal remedies, diets adjusted, and simple exercises prescribed. Sacred snakes, symbols of Asclepius, were allowed to move freely in the sanctuary, embodying renewal and transformation. Inscriptions carved on stone walls recorded miraculous cures: a blind man who regained sight after a dream, a woman who conceived after years of infertility, a paralyzed pilgrim who rose and walked. Whether these accounts were literal truth or symbolic testimony, they reinforce the power of belief. For those who arrived at Epidaurus, hope itself was part of the cure. What fascinates me is how modern some of this feels. Today we speak of holistic health, wellness retreats, and the importance of mental as well as physical care. Epidaurus was already practicing this over 2,000 years ago. It combined environment, ritual, psychology, and medicine into one seamless system. The sanctuary did not separate body and soul. It treated them together, and perhaps that is why it left such a lasting impression. Epidaurus also reveals something about community. Healing there was not a private affair behind closed doors. It was public, shared, collective. Pilgrims ate together, prayed together, slept side by side in the abaton, and watched plays together. Illness was faced as a community, and that sense of shared journey may have been as healing as any ritual. Even those who did not experience miraculous cures still left knowing they had been part of something larger, something meaningful. And though the sanctuary eventually fell silent with the rise of Christianity, its legacy endured. The staff of Asclepius, coiled with a serpent, remains the universal symbol of medicine to this day. The idea that healing requires more than pills, that it requires environment, ritual, story, and hope, has never truly disappeared. In our own time, when people seek yoga retreats, meditation halls, or simply green spaces in crowded cities, they are following the same instinct that led pilgrims to Epidaurus, the belief that healing is not just science but setting, not just cure but meaning. Imagine lying down in that ancient dormitory, the scent of herbs in the air, the murmur of other pilgrims nearby, waiting for dreams to come. Imagine waking with a vision, telling it to the priests, and walking away with a new sense of hope. Whether or not the body was cured, the soul was touched, and sometimes that was enough. So from the crowded streets of medieval Europe, with their leeches and miasma, we now find ourselves in the serene courtyards of Epidaurus, where healing was art, dream, and ritual. It is a reminder that medicine has never been just about the body. It has always been about the human need for meaning, for connection, and for transformation. And as we move forward, we will see how these themes continue to appear in the blending of medicine and magic, in the rituals of ancient Egypt, and in the texts that carried knowledge across centuries. From the tranquil courtyards of Epidaurus, with their sacred springs and dream-filled dormitories, our journey now draws toward its conclusion. And yet, in many ways, the story does not end here, because the legacy of these ancient practices still lingers in the way we think about health, community, and leadership. When we look back across the centuries, from scandalous popes to warrior priests, from bloodletting to sacred theaters, we are reminded that history is not simply a record of mistakes or miracles. It is a mirror, reflecting our ongoing struggle to understand what it means to be human. The holistic traditions of the past carry lessons that remain relevant. Ancient medicine, with all its flaws, taught us that healing requires more than technical skill. It requires care for the whole person, body, mind, and spirit. Epidaurus, with its rituals of sleep and storytelling, may look strange to modern eyes, but its insight was profound. People do not heal in isolation. They heal in spaces that give them hope, in communities that support them, and in rituals that offer meaning. That truth is as powerful now as it was 2,000 years ago. Consider how many of us today still seek balance through practices that echo the ancients. Meditation, mindfulness, and yoga are not so different from incubation rituals that encouraged silence and dreams. Group therapy, theater, and storytelling as tools of healing recall the catharsis of Greek drama. Even the design of hospitals with gardens, natural light, and art reflects an instinct that architecture can soothe as much as medicine can cure. We have changed the vocabulary, but the instinct is the same. Healing is holistic. The same is true when we think about power and leadership. The papal scandals of the Middle Ages remind us that institutions are always shaped by the people who hold office. Leaders can elevate, inspire, and create beauty, as Julius II did with Michelangelo's ceiling, or they can exploit and overreach, as critics said of Alexander VI and Leo X. The lesson is not that institutions are doomed to corruption, but that vigilance is necessary. When ambition overshadows humility, even sacred offices stumble. When leaders forget that their role is service, not spectacle. History records the consequences, yet there is another side to the legacy. The resilience of ordinary people shines through these stories. Believers who kept faith during the Great Schism, pilgrims who sought hope at Epidaurus, patients who trusted in herbs or prayers, they remind us that humanity's search for meaning does not vanish, even when institutions falter. People adapt, resist, and reimagine. That resilience is a lesson in itself. In reflecting on all this, I am struck by how similar we are to those who lived centuries ago. We too live in a world of ambition and excess, of dazzling beauty and deep inequality. We too wrestle with illnesses we do not fully understand, and we too search for spaces, whether hospitals, retreats, or even online communities that can offer comfort, ritual, and belonging. The details change, but the human story remains constant. The enduring symbol of medicine, the staff of Asclepius with its coiled serpent, captures this beautifully. Born in the sanctuaries of ancient Greece, it still appears today on ambulances, hospitals, and medical schools worldwide. It is more than a symbol of healing. It is a reminder that the pursuit of health is as old as humanity itself, and that the lessons of the past still guide us in the present. So what do we take away from this journey? First, that leadership without humility leads to scandal, whether in the courts of popes or the halls of modern politics. Second, that healing without meaning is incomplete, for the body and the soul are not easily separated. Third, that communities, whether gathered around a theater in Epidaurus or around a doctor's office today, are essential to resilience. And finally, that history itself is a form of therapy. By looking back at the strange, the shocking, and the inspiring, we find perspective on our own struggles. Imagine, then, the arc we have traced together. We began with teenage popes rolling dice, and we traveled through courts of warlike pontiffs, Renaissance palaces filled with elephants, medieval streets scented with herbs and incense, and sanctuaries where dreams were medicine. At every turn, human beings searched for power, for healing, and for meaning. Sometimes they stumbled, sometimes they soared, but always they left us lessons. And perhaps that is the greatest gift of history, not that it offers easy answers, but that it shows us we are not alone. Others have faced confusion, illness, and ambition before us. Others have struggled with the gap between ideals and reality. And just as they sought meaning in rituals, art, and belief, so too can we. As we close this chapter, I invite you to carry these lessons with you. When you see the news filled with scandal, remember that institutions have always been fragile, but people endure. When you feel overwhelmed by illness or uncertainty, remember that healing has always been more than medicine. It is community, ritual, and hope. And when you wonder about your place in the larger story, remember that history is not distant. It is alive, echoing in our choices, our fears, and our dreams. So let this journey through scandalous popes, curious cures, and sacred sanctuaries remind you of one simple truth. Humanity, for all its flaws, never stopped searching for meaning. And in that search, in the laughter of a theater, in the silence of a prayer, in the brushstrokes of an artist, or in the dreams of a pilgrim, we find not only the past, but ourselves. And now, as our journey comes to an end, I want to thank you for staying with me through this long path of history. From the dim chambers of medieval Rome to the glowing theaters of Epidaurus, from popes who played politics like a game to healers who listened to dreams, we have seen just how human the past truly was. These stories may seem distant, but in every laugh, every scandal, every search for healing, we can recognize ourselves. If tonight's exploration gave you something to think about, or even simply kept you company as you drifted toward rest, then I am grateful. History does not belong only in textbooks. It belongs in quiet evenings, in shared stories, in the gentle recognition that those who lived before us faced struggles not so different from our own. Before you go, I would love it if you could support the channel. A simple like helps more than you know. Subscribing ensures you won't miss the next chapter of our journey, and sharing this video brings others into our little circle of curious minds. And do not forget, I always enjoy hearing where you are watching from, your city, your country, even the time of day when you tune in. Those comments make this feel less like a lecture and more like a conversation across time zones and across history. As for what comes next, well, there is always more to uncover. The past is vast, and each story opens the door to another. In the next video, we will dive into another chapter of strange, fascinating, and sometimes unbelievable history, one that I promise will be just as full of surprises. So until then, take care of yourselves, rest well, and remember, history is never boring when we allow it to speak in voices that sound a little like our own. Good night, and I will see you soon in the next story.